Story 1. The Jello Cup by Dozen Dimes. This story is more bizarre than terrifying, except for the moment it happened. I worked the night shift as a hospital custodian for a few years. Most nights blurred together. It was just me, my cart of supplies, and the ambient sounds of hospital life machines beeping, distant murmurs of nurses, and the occasional faint television. It's why I can't sleep in silence anymore. I need that background noise. I'd clean patient rooms, some occupied, some empty. My tasks were simple: take out the trash, wipe down surfaces, and restock items like towels and blankets. One late night, near the end of my shift, I entered the room of an elderly woman. She had been there for about 2 weeks, and I'd cleaned her room several times before. She was always asleep during my visits, surrounded by cheerful gifts: flowers, balloons, and stuffed animals. As usual, I announced myself to avoid startling her. "Hello, just here to tidy up a bit," I said softly as I began cleaning. That night, everything seemed normal until I reached for a Jello cup on her nightstand. It was protocol to throw out food items left out too long, so I went to toss it. That's when I felt it. A freezing cold hand touched my elbow. Startled, I jerked back. My heart raced as I looked down and saw her staring at me, her watery, yellowed eyes alert and focused. "Leave it for my grandbaby," she said, her voice clear and firm. I stammered an apology, quickly placing the cup back down. She smiled faintly, closed her eyes, and whispered, "It's his favorite." I scribbled a quick note on my pad, "Do not throw away," and slid it under the cup. By the time I turned back to her, she was asleep again. Assuming she was sedated, I finished cleaning and left, trying to shake off the eerie encounter. The next night, I mentioned the incident to the nurses during shift change. When I described her speaking to me, they exchanged puzzled looks. One nurse told me the woman couldn't have spoken. She'd been in a medically induced coma for days. I was stunned. She definitely spoke to me. She grabbed my arm. She smiled. She even gave me instructions about the Jello. Later that evening, I cleaned her room again. This time, there was a purple Jello cup. As I went to place another note, I whispered, "What flavor does he like?" There was no response, but as I wheeled my cart to leave, I distinctly heard the word, "green." I froze. Her eyes were closed. Did I imagine it? Trembling, I wrote, "Green preferred," on the note and left. 2 days later, I returned to work and learned she had passed away while I was off. A nurse mentioned her family had visited one last time, bringing a green Jello cup. They left shortly before she passed. I couldn't shake the thought. Did she hold on just to share that moment with her grandson one more time? Was it sheer willpower that woke her from her coma to tell me about the Jello? The experience haunted me, but I found comfort in the idea that her final moments were filled with love and connection. Story 2. The Circling Sedan by Steph 920. Back in my 20s, I hopped between jobs, unsure of what I wanted to do. One of those jobs was working the night shift at a gas station. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked it. The pace was slower than retail, and I didn't have to wear heels like at my front desk job. Most nights were quiet. My shift ran from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., but if my car acted up, I'd wait for my boyfriend to pick me up after his shift. Store policy required 2 employees on site at all times, so I wasn't totally alone. Carlos, my coworker, usually stocked the freezer while I manned the register. One night, around 10 p.m., I noticed an old, dark sedan circling the parking lot. Its tinted windows and slow, deliberate movements immediately caught my attention. The car passed the front doors several times, which made no sense. We were a 24/7 station, and our hours were clearly posted. It wasn't uncommon for suspicious vehicles to cruise by, but they usually left once they spotted the cameras or Carlos. This car didn't leave. It kept circling, uneasy, I called Carlos up front and pointed it out. He agreed it was strange, but we decided to keep an eye on it. If anything happened, we'd call for help. Eventually, the car left the lot, and I let out a sigh of relief until it returned 5 minutes later. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The car slowed as it passed by the doors again, and I instinctively moved closer to the register. Carlos and I exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't normal. Was it just someone lost? Or were they planning something? Want to know what happened next? Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales. The strange encounter seemed to be over, or so I thought. About 15 minutes later, they returned. This time, their car pulled up by the front doors, and the passenger window rolled down. The man who leaned out looked too old to be pulling stunts like this. His short, curly gray hair matched the beard on his face. He locked eyes with me, blowing a kiss before flashing a sinister smile. My stomach twisted. I quickly looked down at the counter, pretending it was the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen. I rubbed at invisible spots on the surface, focusing on the tiny brown specks scattered across the beige countertop. Then, I heard a screeching attempt at a burnout. I glanced up just in time to see their car speeding off into the night. I thought that might be the end of it, but no soon enough, they were back, this time pulling up to a gas pump. My gut churned as 3 car doors opened simultaneously. I immediately called for Carlos without breaking my gaze from the car. The driver started fiddling with the gas pump. The guy in the back stood with his back to the vehicle, and the passenger jumped out, performing this strange, jittery shake like he was psyching himself up for something dangerous. Carlos told me to head to the back and stay there, no matter what. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. He added that if I heard or saw anything suspicious, I should call the cops and let Josie know not to come in. I did as he said, retreating behind the swinging doors that separated the front from the back. From there, I couldn't see the register, but could still hear the low murmur of voices. The creepy man whistled as he approached Carlos, greeting him with an overly friendly, "Hola," Carlos responded with a flat, "Hey." Moments later, I heard the distinct crunch of coins hitting the counter. The man's voice turned sickeningly sweet. "Where's the little girl?" he asked. My blood turned cold. "She's on break," Carlos lied. "I wanted the pretty girl to check me out," the man said, his words dripping with menace. Carlos, clearly irritated, cut him off. "Will that be all, sir?" After a pause, the man burst into laughter before sarcastically replying, "Adios, amigo." When I heard the door chime, I cautiously peeked out. The man was gone. Carlos confirmed it. As I stepped out, I saw him picking up the coins the man had carelessly tossed across the counter. Carlos described the guy in detail: clouded, gray eyes, a gummy, toothless grin, and knuckles covered in dried blood and cuts. The thought of seeing that man up close made my skin crawl. Carlos told me to call Josie and let her know to wait in her car when she arrived so he could walk her inside. He also planned to call the cops, a decision I wholeheartedly agreed with. The men eventually left, but lingered briefly across the street before disappearing into the night. The police arrived shortly after, but didn't seem concerned. They took our report and assured us they'd patrol the area, but it felt like a formality. That night, Carlos walked me to my car. Every set of headlights I saw made my heart race, fearing the men were following me. Thankfully, I made it home safely. The next day, our boss called me in to discuss what had happened. To my surprise, he took the situation seriously. He mentioned similar reports of a suspicious red car following women at night outside bars, schools, even workplaces. The men would often ask for help or offer rides, but their intentions were anything but innocent. The realization that I might have been their target made me feel sick. What would have happened if Carlos hadn't been there? Would they have waited for me to leave? Would they have tried something worse? I'll never know. And maybe it's better that way. That night was enough to make me realize how vulnerable I was working late shifts. Shortly after, I switched to daytime hours and eventually found a new job. The fun, quiet nights weren't worth the risk to my safety. I stepped into the meeting room. The only piece of furniture was a single filing cabinet with an attached shelf where stacks of office supplies, pens, notepads, paper clips were haphazardly scattered. The filing cabinet was locked, but I didn't think much of it. I dusted when necessary and wiped down the handles. It was routine, yet something odd caught my eye. The notepads and tan folders in the metal holder were askew, as though someone had bumped them hard. They were empty, unused, but their lopsided arrangement made them look like they had been rifled through. I straightened them out and moved on. I walked into the nearest office, one belonging to a lawyer. That's when I noticed it. The desk was a mess, papers scattered across the desk and floor. A small plant toppled and lying on the floor. Every other time I had cleaned this office, everything had been neatly organized, with confidential documents safely tucked away. We were under strict rules not to go through anything and to report anything out of place. But this felt wrong. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it. The filing cabinet behind the desk stood out. It had a large dent in the front and top, as though it had been punched or kicked. Cautiously, I tried the handle, and with a clunk, the cabinet opened. It had clearly been locked, but the damage to the lock allowed it to open easily. I quickly closed it, feeling uneasy. My eyes then shifted to the bookshelf along the wall, where numerous binders had been pulled out and carelessly scattered. The more I looked around, the more I realized something was terribly off. My gut twisted, and a sense of dread washed over me. I had to get out of there. As I made my way toward the door, my fingers instinctively reached for my phone. I needed to report this something wasn't right. But as I stepped out of the office, I heard it. A creak, the floorboards creaking at the front of the building. The kind of creak you only hear when someone walks on it. Someone was still inside. Before I could react, there was a flash of movement to my left, and then a sharp pain exploded in the side of my head. Darkness consumed me. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, disoriented. It was pitch black, everything was off. The lights had been switched off. I didn't remember turning them off. Slowly, I turned my head, trying not to make a sound. The room was empty, and the creaking of the floor had stopped. I stood up, my head throbbing. My phone was close by, thankfully still on the ground. I grabbed it, surprised to see that I had been out for almost an hour. God knows what had happened during that time. After assessing the knot on my head, no blood, thank goodness, I decided I needed to leave. I grabbed my stuff, left everything in the room as it was, and rushed to my car. My heart raced as I called my boss and then the police, watching the building carefully for any sign of movement. The cops arrived quickly. There was a station nearby, and I explained everything. While I was speaking with them, my boss showed up with a lawyer. As I retold the story, the lawyer confirmed that the office I described was his. I was asked to stay outside while the police went inside with him. It was then that everything took a strange turn. An officer came over to take my statement. His questions were thorough, asking me about every detail, the time, the exact sequence of events. When I finished, he potted me down and, to my shock, handcuffed me. Confusion flooded me. What? Why am I being handcuffed? I asked, trying to process what was happening. The officer told me I wasn't under arrest, just for precaution, but I didn't buy it. I had been attacked. Why was I suddenly the one being treated like a criminal? The officers and lawyer eventually came back outside. The lawyer looked shaken, and the second officer, one I hadn't spoken to before, approached me for a repeat of the story. My head was still pounding, and now I was starting to feel more like a suspect than a victim. Why was I being treated this way? The paramedics checked me out, worried about a concussion. They gave me an ice pack, but the pain was unbearable. As they questioned me, I started doubting myself. Did I do something wrong? What if my fingerprints were found on the handle of the filing cabinet? Would they think I was involved in whatever had happened? The paramedics took me to the hospital, just to be safe, but the whole situation still gnawed at me. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but the doubt was creeping in. I kept wondering what could have happened while I was unconscious. That week, my boss called to check on me. He seemed to ease some of the tension, assuring me that the suspicions surrounding me had completely cleared up. In fact, he had backed me up to the police and the lawyer. The lawyer had confirmed that it wasn't me. He suspected it was a disgruntled client, someone looking for information to use in a legal case. The office had been targeted specifically, and nothing of value had been stolen. No electronics, no money, just confidential files. I was relieved, and with my name cleared, I could return to work. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how strange it all was. I had just happened to show up at the wrong time on the wrong day. It turns out the thief had been trying to steal sensitive information to give to their lawyer, but the lawyer had reported it, knowing they couldn't use it. My boss had known more about the situation than he let on, but I appreciated the reassurance. I kept my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I had come to being blamed for something I didn't do. That was the day I learned that sometimes, being in the wrong place at the wrong time could make you the prime suspect, even when you're completely innocent. You know, there was a time when I wanted to go check out a creepy house on one of my deliveries, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. My friend wanted to get out and investigate, but I told him no. I drove off before he could get out, and honestly, we never went back. After that, I didn't even Google what happened. I don't really want to know. Once I find a better job, I'm done with deliveries. But yeah, that's my story. Speaking of creepy places, should I check out those creepy houses, Raven? Guess I could share another story if I do. Just kidding, I'm not going in. By the way, I've been listening to your stories during these long drives, and I hope one day you'll hear mine too. So, my friends, that was a collection of some night shift horror stories. Stories that happened while working those long, dark shifts. Yeah, I've got a few of my own to share. The worst night shift experience? Well, there were a couple. Back when I worked at Pizza Hut, right after high school during my first year or two of college, one of the drivers went out for a delivery and got robbed. The poor girl never came back, obviously. The managers were more upset that she didn't return with the pizza or the cash than the fact she was robbed at gunpoint. Like, no. She was probably traumatized and didn't have anything left on her. But hey, that's just me. Then there was this one time when I worked at Blockbuster. I had to do inventory one night, starting at 10 p.m. and working until 8 a.m. They didn't tell me how long it would last, and I wasn't exactly thrilled. To make matters worse, they had me listen to the Top Gun soundtrack on repeat for 4 hours. That was probably one of the worst shifts of my life. But hey, it wasn't a horror story, just a nightmare in a different way. So, those are my night shift stories. The Pizza Hut one definitely takes the cake. Being robbed at gunpoint is pretty horrifying. Blockbuster? Not so much. That was just exhausting. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button. If you're new to the channel and want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe. I post about 3 times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the week. I also have a podcast over on Spotify, Audible, Apple, and Pandora, where you can hear the same stories, but presented in a different format. One episode, there is usually 2 YouTube videos. If you're feeling bold, leave me a comment letting me know what you thought, or just how you're doing. Also, if you'd like early access to content like this, You can join my Patreon or YouTube memberships. Patrons get exclusive early access to my novel. Yep, I've finished it. It's a psychological thriller, 22 chapters long, about 375 pages. I just finished the cover today, and it's looking great. I'm planning to launch it in January, and if even 2 people buy it, I'll consider it a success. I'll also make it available on Kindle Unlimited. And yes, signed copies will be available through the Ko-fi link once it's printed. Anyway, that's all for today, friends. I hope you're having a beautiful day, and I'll see you again soon. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important, and you are the best version of yourself. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Much love, and as always, sleep well.